Thank you so much for coming tonight. We have a really special night. This is going to be one of I think it's a breakthrough at Digital Hollywood to be able to have a session of this magnitude. We've been doing Digital Hollywood for 20 years. And thank you. And the roots of Digital Hollywood, believe it or not, started with discussions of user interface, virtual reality, and of course CD-ROM. Who could forget that? So while life went on, the internet arrived, and we became a business development IPO event, and sort of lost our way and lost our roots. Life somehow came full circle. And the technology over the last few years clearly exploded and has given way where every platform now is emerging into a user interface experience that we only dreamt of 20 years ago. So, with that said, I want to introduce Phil Leleveld, who is our moderator for the evening. Phil? Thank you very much.
Cool. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm going to try and speak as little as possible because the panelists are totally amazing tonight. Just a couple of sentences on background on me. I run the Virtual and Augmented Reality Initiative at the USC Entertainment Technology Center. We're essentially a think tank sponsored by the studios and the consumer electronics industry to look at the future of entertainment, help them avoid format wars, introduce them to new technologies, and help build communities. One of the things I've been doing for the last year or so is putting on events that bring the studio and the Silicon Beach, or whatever you want to call it, virtual reality community together to discuss things like the emerging language of VR, shooting live action VR, as well as computer-generated VR, and that type of thing. But having said that, I'm Philip, and I'd like to bring up the panelists right now, and then we'll have them introduce themselves. So come on up. Oh, and try and figure out which name tag to sit in front of. All right. So this is truly going to be interesting because we have 4 stars of this area, and they come from 4 different perspectives. So let's see what we can get going here in terms of a conversation. But first, I'd just like each of you going down the line, starting with John Underkoffler here, to say, essentially just tell us a little bit about what you're working on so the audience has a perspective of where you'll be coming from.
My name is John Underkoffler. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Los Angeles-based Oblong Industries. We are, in some sense, a spin-off of the MIT Media Lab. I'm a child of the MIT Media Lab. We're in the late 80s and early and even late 90s. I was engaged in a kind of deeply psychotic, long-term infatuation with the user interface based on the idea that 10 years into the Macintosh, we ought to be doing something different. It's 30 years later now, and we're still not doing something different, but maybe by the end of this evening, we'll all mutually have figured something out. The company Oblong is also, in a slightly less conventional sense, a spin-off of the film Minority Report, which through the typical series of clerical errors, I ended up serving as the technology advisor for. But really, if we want to go back and look at that film, which is now 12, 13 years old, it gave a few of us an opportunity to run really what's the world's largest user focus group test. We put new ideas about UI, about computation, on screen in a kind of radically simplified form for people to look at and vote on, I suppose, with their eyes and with their tickets. And so that's what Oblong builds today in a commercial setting. And our ground center for us, the epicenter of all of our work, is the UI, the proposition that a radically more capable and kind of aesthetically motivated and human UI is actually a massive, massive advantage, even though we don't talk about that. But maybe we will tonight.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Richard Marks. I work for Sony PlayStation. And every time John consults on a new movie, my bosses say, "Can we do that on a PlayStation?" Iron Man is not quite possible yet, but
Sorry.
but I direct the PlayStation Magic Lab. We take technology and try to make experiences out of it. Mostly, I've focused on interface. Starting 1999 is when I joined Sony, and worked on the iToy and the PlayStation Move and a lot of other camera-based tracking technologies. So and now we're working on PlayStation VR. My team did the initial tracking for the headset and the Move controllers, and then we handed that off to the product groups.
So just to point out the differences, John is doing VR and user interfaces without head-mounted displays, just with people in a room. And Richard is doing it with the PlayStation VR, a head-mounted display.
I'm doing VR without the V.
Okay. Philip.
Hi, I'm Philip Rosedale, and let's see, in 1999, when Richard was starting at Sony, I left my job up in Seattle at Real Networks to start Second Life, which is virtual world. And what I'm doing today is
Without the reality.
without the virtual reality, a virtual world without the virtual reality, perhaps early. And today I'm working, my new company is called High Fidelity, and we're basically, I guess, doing a similar sort of thing. But this time we're building a kind of an operating system for shared virtual reality. We're working on software, not on hardware. And we're trying to focus on two big problems. One is this social idea, like can we erase the barrier between two people being face-to-face using this new virtual reality hardware? Can we write the software to put us next to each other in a way that is real? And then the other problem we're working on is how do we build really, really big virtual worlds? My personal interest is in kind of planet scale, or what comes next sort of questions about virtual reality, as compared to, say, gaming and entertainment. So that's what I'm working on today. It's a lot of fun.
Fantastic. And Jack?
Hi, I'm Jack McCauley, and I am a teacher at UC Berkeley. I work at Jacobs Institute in their innovation and research facility. It's part of mechanical engineering. I'm actually an electrical engineer. I don't know why I ended up in mechanical engineering, but I did. I'm also a co-founder of Oculus VR, and prior to that, I was the chief engineer on Guitar Hero and head designer for their peripherals. Thank you. And prior to that, I had a bunch of experience. I worked at Microsoft, all kinds of companies, mostly in the startup space to get acquired. So I also have a research laboratory located near the Silicon Valley, and what we do is VR research, and specifically focused on tracking the position of people in a room, trying to find out very accurately how they're moving, and which basically means I reverse engineered valve system to find out how it works. That's what I did. So and I'm trying to take VR and put it in the hands of everyone and make it less expensive. That's what I want to do. Thanks.
Very good. So, thank you to all of them. Excellent. So, here at the conference, we've heard all types of images of what the future of VR should look like. I'd like to just throw out to everyone on the panel, what do you consider to be the baseline acceptable VR experience? What experiences are you designing for, and what technologies are needed for it? You know, can it be just the phone as the baseline, or do you need the head-mounted display, or do you need tracking? What are you shooting for? And anyone can go for it.
I'll try to answer that. So what Valve and Oculus and other people that are not telling you is it takes a very high-powered computer to run virtual reality. A kick-ass machine with a gaming rig with a lot of memory and a high bandwidth GPU, which, you know, if you add it up, it's a couple $1,000. And I feel that if you took the computational loading off of the host PC somehow, perhaps putting some of that inside the head mount, that perhaps you could get the cost down to the point where someone with a laptop could run it. Unlikely right now that would be the case. Mobile offers certain advantages. You've got a mobile GPU, low power. You've got 4 and 8 core processors, which means you've got basically 8 to 4 computers running simultaneously inside of it. And somehow if you could transpose that inside the head mount and put that inside the head mount, you could offload a lot of the computational load from the PC. So with mobile, I mean, you basically have a cell phone strapped to your face, but you really don't have a lot of options. You can't really, I mean, you can turn your head and look around in the application. You can't walk around with it on because it doesn't do very good kinematic modeling, which is modeling your body movements and translating that into actual physical distances. It doesn't do that at all, as a matter of fact. Doing that, and the other thing is, like, if you're going to do a mobile-based, or if you have a lot of low-power mobile processing power inside the head mount, you have to be able to track the eyes, and that's because your the center of your eye, which is the highest concentration of sensors, only needs to see the high-resolution rendering. Outside that space, you really don't. If you look around, it's kind of blurry out there. You really don't need that kind of rendering. So if you had eye tracking, you could actually use a lower powered mobile GPU inside of it and not render the entire image in front of you. So that's what I think, if that answers your question. That's what I think. Yeah.
Any other opinions?
I think it's really about value. I mean, if you have this kind of friction of having to wear a headset, you need to get enough value out of the experience to make it worth it, to put it on. I mean, Google Cardboard, the value you have is it's very easy to put up to your eyes quickly and take it away. That's why you maybe can get away with an experience that isn't quite as high fidelity as the other ones. But for me, what I'm most interested in is the highest fidelity possible experience you can get, which involves a nice headset, which then means the experience has to be good enough to be worth it financially and encumbrance-wise. And so I want to be able to do things in VR that I can't do any other way, otherwise it's not worth it to me. So being able to reach into the world, grab something in the world, do things that I can't do in the real world, because recreating the real world in virtual reality doesn't seem all that useful to me because we can already do those things in the real world. But, I mean, I'm from a gaming company, so in the VR world I can shoot fireballs and I can, look down and see Spider-Man's arms or something like that. So those things I can never do in the real world. That's the kind of thing I want.
Go ahead. Philip?
Yeah, Richard actually said it earlier today, and I'd underscore it. There's really two ideas around VR. One is that we're putting on some sort of a movie screen on our heads, and we're doing remarkable things with that. And there are certainly things we can do. We can watch movies, and we can do lots of things just with our eyes and our heads. But I actually think that the revolution here, when we look back in some years' time, will be remembered as being the absolute requirement of both the hands, the head and the hands. The idea here is that we're going to go beyond the mouse. And I think that the real experiences that are going to be genuinely disruptive are experiences where we have agency, which I think was the word exactly that you used, where we can reach into the virtual world and do things. And that basically means 18 degrees of freedom, if you want to be a tech nerd about it. Each of your head and your hands represents 6 degrees of freedom, 3 in motion and 3 in rotation. If you can do that with your head and your hands at the same time, that's an order of magnitude more than we've ever been able to do, like with a computer. The mouse is 2. So that is really different. And I think is the basic starting point for VR.
John, do you want to describe?
Those 18 are trivial to us. It takes no effort on our brain.
We don't
to-
think about it.
Yeah.
We're doing it right now.
And that's all before you flex your fingers, right?
That's right. Your
That's where you
fingers
still
are-
got a stump.
Lots more.
Right. John, do you want to talk about Oblong for a second and kind of put it in the perspective of this? It's more business to business, right, in terms of the implementation, but is the experience similar to what they're describing in terms of tracking and moving objects just without the headset, or is it something different?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's sort of aimed at a convergence point that Philip was suggesting, and the idea that there's agency, that there's ultimate agency, and at the end of the day, maybe it doesn't matter so much whether you've put the bucket on your head or you're sitting in the middle of a room with pixels all over the walls or whatever the case is, but you need a way to control all that, right? Because VR without an input device, VR without a UI is just 360 cinema. And again, we want something more than that. We want experiences that are unique, that are uniquely afforded by this kind of technology. I think VR is really, really nascent. We've basically invented the TV, but there's no content and there's no language of film, right? Jesse Lasky hasn't gotten on his wagon with Cecil B. DeMille and gone out. And it's raining in Arizona, so he goes to Hollywood, but he brings with him the kind of theatrical knowledge that enables him at least to make that first feature-length film. And we're still in advance of that. So the exciting thing is that there's so much work still to be done. The thing that I think is maybe the most exciting opportunity is to start to think toward a conformed UI, a lingua franca that would be relevant across VR and AR and the regular screens that we're used to and mobile devices and the rest of it. Because we're finally exiting that world in which there's a single or a very small number of forms for computation.
Mm-hmm. So let's walk through a couple of elements of the technology itself, starting with head tracking. And let me start with Jack, if you could just talk briefly about head tracking, and others can jump in. What are the issues around it in terms of the technology, problems with it, latency, other things? Just discuss head tracking for a second and its place in virtual reality.
Well, so I don't want to get too technical because people fall asleep. So
keep it at a high level,
especially after a glass of wine and dinner. What causes nausea? And really, it's a sum of things. In this sum is a sum of errors. So there's an error due to this. There's an error due to this. There's an error due to that. Take all those things together, and that's what causes nausea. But by far the biggest error is the mismatch between what your head feels, what your ears feel, and what your eye is seeing. And there's a reflex, it's called vestibulo-ocular reflex, and that reflex, if it's miscued, can cause nausea. There's another component of that, and that's the expectation component. In other words, your brain has trained you over your many years about what to expect in the next sort of couple milliseconds or 20 milliseconds. So, you don't want to give people roller coaster rides in VR. It just doesn't work. It makes you sick. You want to avoid that thing. Like cockpit games, like racing games where you're flying around a corner and you feel absolutely no G-forces. That's probably, for the novice VR user, something to avoid. When I talk about error, I mean the errors due to the common things like the delay between the time your head moves and the time the screen, the computer in the system displays the new scene. That's called latency. That error is, depending upon who you talk to, 20 to 40 milliseconds, which is really within the bandwidth of a lot of machines, computers, to actually do that round trip.
So how close are we to solving that? That's a technical problem. Is there a technical solution on the horizon?
Yes, and what's interesting is you go to the demos with Vive, and you go to these other demos. They've carefully controlled the environment. They don't put you in a racing game when you sit down, or there's a really terrible application which puts you inside of a spaceship, flipping around and rotating around. You just don't do that. But those demos are controlled so that you're doing sort of mundane, everyday things in a virtual world with these fantastic cues and so forth. So the biggest thing to do, and I bring up head tracking, is to very carefully match the head position for the computer. And I think I will pass this around in a minute and explain what it is, but I think if you can solve that problem, probably the best implementation that I've seen personally is Valve's implementation, which is very, very simple and elegant, and it actually reduces the computational loading, the amount of computer horsepower it takes there's no frame buffer, there's no image to read in and then process. It's just very straightforward. It can be done with a very simple processor inside the head mount. That aspect of it, that's kind of what I'm working on. I would like to take Valve's approach and like make it really, really, really cheap. And I talked to the developer and I said, why don't you use this and this and this and this and this? And he says, we tried all that and none of it works. Well, I don't, doesn't sound like he wants to.
So let me throw out an alternative approach, because we're talking about technology and we're talking about art. And Brent Bushnell from 2-Bit Circus was on a panel 2 panels ago today, and he mentioned that he gets around the sim sickness problems with latency issues by putting people in motion seats, and the distraction basically overcomes the issues related to latency. It's like putting counter pressure on a pain point. So there are alternatives to it beyond, you want to solve it technically, but there are artistic workarounds that can also work. So does anybody have other thoughts on sim sickness and basically how to avoid it, or what you think causes it and what you're working on?
I've done a demonstration where you stand on a vibrating plate, and that kind of just masks your vestibular system to some degree because it's getting a lot of white noise into it, and then you don't have those issues. But you don't have a very good balance either. So
The other observation is many people believe that the nausea response is a way that your brain gets rid of basically alcohol. The nausea response is an error between the vestibular and optical systems. When you drink or when you take a drug, the optical portion of your brain, which is the kind of part on the outside, is affected immediately and first. The vestibular system tends to kind of keep sending the same data, and we see a difference between those two as novel, and therefore, makes us throw up. There's evidence anecdotally, though, particularly like in my company, where we've spent a lot of time kind of under the HMD, so to speak, that we train to adapt to these things. So one of the things I would definitely say from our own work is we will all learn. If anybody here is a pilot, if you've ever done like aerobatic flight, you'll see that you basically learn to not throw up anymore. And I believe the same thing will happen if we really want to use VR environments. Maybe that's a little far, but.
Very cool.
I think the term is easing them into the VR experience instead of,
So the head is really, really sensitive to latency in particular, and with latency, you can compensate for latency with prediction to some degree, and the head is very, very predictable. Actually, you cannot change the direction of your head very quickly compared to how fast we can sense things. So the hands are much harder to get like that because you can change their direction so quickly, but it doesn't matter nearly as much for the hands. So actually the problem isn't as bad as it could be, I guess.
I think there are more problems in hand tracking and articulation of the hand, and as John said, the fingers. It's just a nightmare to get into that. But we're getting there. I mean, we're getting there.
Let's talk about hands for a second. So where are we in terms of tracking hands with your different solutions? And
this was a war in your company,
more
wasn't it? The hands versus controllers.
Yeah.
It was a discussion, let's say. Yeah, I mean, we, as early as 2004, we were tracking individual fingers to sub-millimeter precision in X, Y, and Z. That's, of course, all using an insanely expensive Vicon or equivalent optical motion capture system. and then optical tags on gloves that no one really wants to wear. So it's possible. The trade-off is usually one of precision versus volume, and at the consumer level, you see that in the difference between a sensor like the Leap motion sensor and a sensor like, let's say, the Kinect. Kinect gives you relatively low fidelity, low spatial fidelity information over a wider field of view. The Leap is the opposite, higher precision over a very, very constrained volume. And so I think really until we can get both at the same time, it's not going to be particularly satisfying because you can't walk around very much.
And any other body parts matter? I mean, Amir Rubin was on a panel and he's doing foot tracking. Is that going to be important, or is that a niche peripheral?
You said foot tracking?
Foot motion on top of hand motion. Any thoughts?
I think that the hands are by far the most important. I mean,
Okay.
we do so much with our hands, and our feet for most people are like clubs. So you know, maybe you would swing them and hit something with them, but you wouldn't do much more than that. You can walk, of course, or something like that. But
Also, as Jeff was saying, or Jack was saying, the immersion is a matter of degrees. There's no one thing that causes us to be broken away from it. It's a sum of all these things being right. With respect to the body, the hand's projection on the brain, the homuncular projection of the hand, is so huge that if we can see our fingers, if any of you have tried this, the experience in VR of waggling your fingers in front of a camera where you're using something like the Leap motion sensor to detect them just feels almost, it's just incredibly intense. It's an intense feeling to see these avatar fingers move. And that's because your brain has such an enormous amount of its machinery attached to your fingers that when you see that happen, you feel this incredible sensation. The feet, however, are much smaller. So I would say that we've got to track all of it. We're working right now on moving the whole body to follow what we know, which is your head and your hands. But the feet are less important, the hips are less important because we have less of our mental computation directed toward it.
actually, seeing your hands in VR is really powerful. But it's also very strange when you see your hands and they're not rendered quite right. So we find that it's much better to err on the side of slightly cartoonish, or like if you make these dead mannequin hands that you look down at, they're not rendered properly, it's really not a good feeling. It feels like you're like inhabiting somebody else's body or something.
USC has tentacles instead of hands, right?
Right. So some of the systems out there use hand tracking devices, handheld devices, instead of trying to sense your hands, but they project a hand into the virtual space. Is that adequate? Is there a use for that, or do we want to actually move in the future towards hand sensing?
Well, that's it.
I mean, this gets into like, if you gave me the full perfect hand position in a game, would I be able to use that effectively in the game? And it's still hard to use that in a physical way that would even make sense. Whereas an abstracted controller, which has an animation of a hand, I can do a lot more with that because I know how it's going to behave to some degree. I have some control over what it's doing. So it's like a single degree of freedom to grab, like a trigger, is a lot easier to work with for a game designer than this completely arbitrary, high-dimensional skeleton.
You got to have a button. It's a weird problem. The Minority Report thing is cool, but the problem is if you wanted to throw a ball in VR and you want to release the ball, now think about that for a second. We can simulate the motion of that ball, but there's that moment where you let it go and it keeps going along the line that your hand was moving. That moment, or the pulling of a trigger on a gun, has to be designated in a way where you get feedback. You know what I mean? You've got to know when that button comes down. And so I personally believe from our own work that although we certainly want to track every joint in the body if we can, there is this requirement of a kind of a tool, not when you're talking with your hands, but for anything else. Click and pull that thing on the table over to me or whatever. That requires at least one button and maybe more, right?
We did early on with the PlayStation Move, one of the developers was doing a Frisbee game, and so we have a button, and it's, was 90 times a second that we get that button release information. That's not fast enough because the timing of when you release a Frisbee out of your hand changes its angle where it flies so much that actually, you couldn't throw a Frisbee in a way that felt good. So we had to give them 180 times a second the button release event, and that's just trying to do that for a hand tracker, you can imagine the fidelity you'd have to be able to release a Frisbee in a way that would ever feel anything close to right.
Do you see a future for other types of, this is about user interface, so are there other types of user interface approaches coming down the pike? I mean, is voice activation going to be something where you're looking? Is that going to be a good controller? Or do you want to depend on things that we're used to like hands? Is there a role for example, there are headsets out there that track your eyes and respond to where you're looking. Is there a future in that? Where do you see that going? Does anyone have an opinion?
Well, I touched on the full-wheel rendering
Sure.
aspect of that. Certainly, being able to look at an icon or a cue in the system and then maybe blink your eyes to trigger it, it's useful. As far as gameplay, though, you know, you brought up the aspect of the controllers. Most games are written around user input in the form of a device in front of you or a device in your hand that you then trigger. I'm not sure I know how to make that leap from doing that type of style of doing things and that type of method of doing things to actually poking and pulling at maybe icons out floating around in your virtual world. I mean, sort of, you design a game and your thinking is, you know, you use an input device and you use the input device to control the game. It's a completely different sort of application where, you know, you have to pause, reach up, and pull something out of the screen or blink at it. You know, I haven't thought about the user interface aspect very much, but
Okay, then let me double back to hands for a second and go to John, who was involved in Minority Report. Do you think the future of user interface when it comes to using your hands is going to be some sort of sign language or some sort of virtual button controller in space? Because Minority Report had Tom Cruise doing hand motions, like
Yeah.
a language. Is that the way things are going to go? Go ahead.
I think that stuff is useful in a limited setting, to be quite honest. When we built the Minority Report stuff at Oblong for real, in the real world, operating realistically, in 2004, we found that there was enormous power in the combination of high fidelity position and orientation information, which lets you point, and extremely low fidelity sensing of finger flexion, which means that for each finger, we basically care about this, and this. You know, extended, curled, and all the way curled in. And that combination of high and low fidelity lets an arbitrary cross-section of users, a very large one, reliably make gestures that can be, again, reliably sensed. But the reward you get for accurate pointing, which is to say action at a distance, is very, very large. But then the question is, how much of your computational world, your computational existence, can you reasonably control through pointing alone? It certainly does something that you cannot do without a direct spatial manipulatory approach like pointing. So I think that for me, let me step back or up a level or some direction, I don't know which one it is. The question is really one of literalism versus abstraction. We've got to find that correct point on the spectrum that goes from literal to abstract. And I think a lot of the problems that we're talking about so far with fidelity and frame rate and update and stuff, that those are huge problems only in the case where we're interested in an absolutely representational space, right? Where you're moving your body, an exact replica of your body, through a space that's sort of isomorphic to the real world. Then you care about every one of those details. But I think it was Henry Jenkins who said nothing has so retarded the evolutionary advance of video games as much as the drive to realism, photorealism, representationalism. So I'm super excited about kind of non-representational, abstract experiences that are possible inside VR, AR, or what have you, right? There's that great early 70s paper in early brain science and cognitive science called What Is It Like to Be a Bat, right? Which posits that there's some distance, some cognitive distance between us as mammals evolved to a certain extent and other kinds of mammals and maybe non-mammals. And can you even know what it's like to be something that isn't outfitted with flesh and wired up the way a human is? And I think VR, for the first time, might offer that possibility. But to get there, we've got to get past the point where we're saying, well, this has to be, we have to have subsurface rendering for the skin and, sub-millimeter precision, blah, blah, blah. I would say.
Even if you step back out of VR, we've taken like the PlayStation Move controller and mapped it to the head of a snake. And so you move this head of the snake around and the whole body is figured out, with some kind
Yeah.
of physical animation.
Kinematics
And it just feels like I am the snake. I mean, I'm not the snake because it's in my hand, but I feel like I have control and I'm kind of puppeting the snake. And
But you are the snake.
Right,
In every
yeah.
cognitive sense, you are the snake. You were the snake when you were 3 years old and it was a piece of string
Yeah.
or whatever. Like, we're good at that. We don't have to make it so literal.
And then the snake shoots fire out of its mouth.
yes,
so
as one does.
everything's better with fire.
More fire, please. Do we have any?
What?
Do we have any fire?
No, right here.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's interesting, though. We do best understand and value and can most easily repeat those things that we've seen before. My own experience with design, and also I can tell you a story from Second Life which echoes this. When Second Life started, I sort of imagined it to be this enormous building kit of where anybody could make anything they wanted to, and so my expectation was that we would see this immediate kind of exploration of design space, that it would be this infinity of impossible buildings and spaces and colors and things that we'd never seen before. And the reality is that when we let people into Second Life and they started building, they built what looked a lot like Los Angeles. That is to say, everybody had
Maybe Vegas.
yeah, or Vegas, or Los Angeles, Vegas. It was a cantilevered house hanging out over Malibu with palm trees and deck chairs and a boat at a dock below it. And people didn't build the Starship Enterprise or a land speeder to drive around. They bought a Lamborghini in the virtual world. Now, why would you buy a Lamborghini? Well, the reason why is because that is the thing that you know. It has a distinct value. Even ask yourself whether you'd rather want the Lamborghini or the land speeder, and you'll see the answer is not as simple in a social environment as you might think. So I think with respect to design and VR, the same is true. The beauty of us as humans is that we will learn, as Henry Jenkins says, we will be inspired to learn new ways of doing things. The mouse was one of those ways. But for the most part, we at least want to start exactly with things that we can remember and easily use. All the design that we've been doing in VR and playing, I've come up with crazy ideas. Shouldn't we be able to do this or that? And it'll be so quick to learn. No, it isn't. What's quick to learn is, grasping with your thumb and forefinger and lifting something up, pulling that trigger and letting it go down again, and having it fall when you let go of it, because that's what we expect. So I would say that it is true that we're going to rapidly innovate into this space, but if you look at Second Life and if you look at the work we've done so far, it does seem we're going to sort of stay with the literal, at least to get started.
Yeah, we've had the most success with having people have, they have the 6 degree of freedom controllers, but they only have one trigger and no other buttons. And you say, that's all you can do in the world is grab stuff. And if it happens to be a weapon, then the trigger becomes a trigger after that. But, that's really simple to understand. You can just jump right in and you just know what you should be doing without any coaching.
Do you want to say anything?
Actually, one more step to that, though, which we started to talk about but then stopped. I think when the interface is transparent to you and you don't even know you're using it is when it's best. And eye tracking is one of those kind of interfaces that comes like that, where we have a demonstration not in VR where you're tracking somebody's eyes and they're playing a game, and basically whatever they're looking at is where they shoot in this game. It shoots wherever your eyes are looking. And we have people sit down and we're telling them we're going to give them an eye tracking demo, and they start playing this game and they just hit everything they try to shoot at. But they just think they're really good at the game, and they say, well, so when are we going to turn on the eye tracking? Or you really think you've been able to shoot whatever you want in the whole demo, and it just worked like that? No, they just expect that will work, actually, and it does work. Your eyes are very good at selection. It would break every first-person shooter game out there if we had eye tracking in there, because you would just always get a perfect headshot every time you shot something, and so that'll redefine how we use that information.
That's coupled with other controllers, though, right? So you can turn it on and off?
Yeah,
Otherwise, you're shooting everything you look
actually,
at.
eyes are really good for where you're looking, but they're not good for an action. They're an intent, but not an action. So you need like a button or something else, a gesture, to make that eye tracking actually
So
do
we could
something.
get into facial tracking and lifting your eyebrows when you want to shoot.
All those things are much slower than buttons, though. Buttons are far faster than any kind of gesture
Interesting.
or eyebrow or blink. So.
But the other thing about the eyes, though,
Yeah.
But also you said like finger tracking, like even lifting up this coffee cup and putting it back down is actually really hard to do well in VR. Whereas like posting a graviton beam and lifting up that speaker is something a little easier.
Uh-huh.
So could you all comment on if it's like superpowers or like augmenting our skills and how much we want to interface?
Yeah, action at a distance. We grab things at a distance in high fidelity, and it's super, 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 super cool. You were right, Greg. It's super cool. I mean, in flying in Second Life, even back then, I'd be doing a bad demo and everything would be going wrong and the computer would be disconnecting and whatnot. And this is a long time ago when we started that and the computers were slow. And the person would be frustrated and I'd be like, and I'd hit the page up button, which just made you fly up into the air. And we'd do this pull back, this animation, and everybody would catch their breath. We used to do it, it was almost like just a joke. We would just do it because you'd hear the person go, and then they'd, oh, well, that's cool, okay. I like that, I want to fly around in the room. And so I think that simplifying things and action at a distance is definitely a design direction that we're going to see. What I was going to say about the eyes, though, was remember there's a social aspect to this, which is what we're working on. Eyes to control things is totally awesome. Eyes for foveated rendering, absolutely. It's incredible. I agree. Richard showed me one of these demos. It's incredible. But looking into somebody's eyes and seeing them moving while they watch, the tiny movements, while they look at the different parts of your face, or, you see their eyes jitter around or look up as they're thinking, oh, that's a crazy experience, which is just now getting built for these sort of Generation 2 head-mounted displays. And
So for VR, that matters a lot.
yeah.
All right, so building on that, jumping on that. So talk about social interaction in VR. Not just the fact that you can look at someone, but how do you establish a personality in a VR space? And it applies to all of you. It goes to all of you. How can you communicate your personality in this virtual realm? What tools, what technologies, what approaches are you thinking about?
I get asked a lot of time what's the most powerful VR experience I've ever had, and often I cite actually coming into Philip's lab and just a demonstration where you have two people in VR together and you have spatial audio and the person just leans real close to you and whispers right next to your ear. That is really, really powerful to have somebody in that space because it feels like there's somebody, kind of invaded your personal place where you don't want. And so having the ability to have a feeling like that, even though the person could be on the other side of the world, that's really powerful, I think, for actually feeling like that person is who they are.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment?
Well, obviously, Facebook bought Oculus for a reason. And, everyone knows what Facebook is about. I think it would be really, really cool to go visit my brother or my sister or my aunt somewhere and hang out for a while in my virtual world and then go back home or go to a party, a virtual party. I can't foresee what Facebook will do with that, and no, they probably don't even know. But obviously, they're interested in that aspect of it. The social aspect's very important. Gaming might be just a very small segment of VR. It's kind of where it started, but there's a whole another aspect of VR that, it's wide open right now. There's going to be so much coming out of it. I think, people talk about these 360 cameras and so forth, and it'd be really cool to go to a movie and actually be in the movie with the characters or walk around in the movie. Obviously there's problems with it. They can't see your face. You're wearing this thing over your eyes. Eyes are very important when you're communicating with someone. You're looking in their eyes or looking at their facial expressions. How do you go from that to rendering a character with those similar things? It would just be looking at a mannequin because this headset can't see your expression. So that's a pretty fundamental problem. And, Toy Box, Oculus, you see this sort of mesh head floating around and you hear the voices. It works pretty well. It's pretty cool. But really, that's an interesting question. I mean, you have to take this and translate it into the virtual world with wearing something over your eyes. So it's very hard.
It kind of goes back to John's comment about literalism versus abstraction. In the real world, I can establish trust by getting close and whispering in your ear, which is what spatial audio allows for. Are there things unique to VR, or is VR just going to reproduce the real world when it comes to interpersonal relationships?
Well, if you just think about sitting in a group like you are at these tables right now and what information you're conveying, the basic stuff you would jump to is all adds up to the experience. So your head pose and posture, you all nod when I'm talking a little bit. You actually nod in concert with me. You'll nod actually a little more emphatically if you were thinking you might step in and start speaking. We can see all that stuff. And the good news about VR right now is that we can send, I mean, with a little work, we can send low latency, high quality audio to you in 3D, like Richard was talking about. We can also send where my head is, the nodding and the upper body leaning, talking with the hands. Obviously, we all know that, you know, to a greater or lesser extent for different people, that's a very, very powerful tool. Those basic things can be done if you have a head-mounted display and hand controllers and a pair of, you know, headphones on. With the right software, you can be pretty close to face with somebody. Our own experience has been that's astonishing. We've done demonstrations where we've recorded ourselves just moving our bodies as avatars, then turned off the sound and had other people at the office watch that we use the same avatar, you know, that same sort of generic person doing this, and you can tell within 10 seconds exactly who it is. You don't know that you can until you try this experiment, but trust me, you can. If it's your spouse, you know in like less than 1 second. If it's a coworker, you know in 10 seconds. This has been studied by other people than us. But the basic sound being transmitted with low latency over the internet, plus the movement of the pose, as we say in this industry, of your head and your hands is sufficient to communicate extremely well.
Okay.
Everybody out there, who reads science fiction? What are the two significant precursors of VR in science fiction? Good, and? Before Ready Player One. Come on, Neuromancer. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so you got Gibson, you got Stevenson. One is representational. That's Snow Crash. Huh?
Phil K did.
Dick didn't do the...
He did special.
Where? We'll talk afterwards. And then you've got Gibson in Neuromancer doing an absolutely non-representational sort of, sensory and data-rich data space. Who wants to live in which one? Who wants to live in Stevenson's Snow Crash?
Snow Crash?
Who wants to...
What about Ready Player One, though, John?
That's 2 decades later. I'm talking about the early stuff. And who wants to live in Gibson's Neuromancer Matrix?
Well,
Okay, so one person in each one. I think we're all out of business here. Good night.
It's a good first choice, then.
So what VR do you want? Holograms?
Holodeck.
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 But is the holodeck a depiction
You
of
live
the
in it
world?
already. Here we are.
It looks just like this.
I'm serious.
Only
What do people want?
pixelated.
It's a good question.
What would you like to live in?
I'm here.
All right, there you go.
Well,
Then-
so we tend to find that people often play video games for aspirational reasons. I mean, Guitar Hero, I want to be a rock star, so I feel like a rock star when I play Guitar Hero. That's why I play. Superheroes, I want to have those superpowers. And a lot of what the technology we put in is to making us feel more like superheroes, actually. So eye tracking gives you an ability to have the force. I can reach out with my spatial controller, look at something and pick it up and then throw it whichever direction I want. Or I can, there's so many things the interface can enable to give me these superpowers in VR. So what I want, the VR I want, is to be a superhero, right? Be able to do things I can't do every day.
So have any of you looked into that and given yourself or your avatar unhuman characteristics like arms with 4 elbows or tentacles? Because there's some studies that seem to indicate that it might affect you psychologically when you go in and out of it. Have you guys thought about it? The idea being, if I had a tentacle, when I took it off, I'd have trouble getting used to my arms for a few seconds.
Well, it's funny, you also don't see any really popular superheroes who are that different, right? have powers, but they're not four-armed, or
Right.
the really popular ones. Maybe because.
But I'm trying to get back to the idea of we don't want to build Los Angeles again. We want
Right.
to build something totally unusual, in which case you want avatars that are totally unusual too. Philip?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think a somewhat related point, though, is that, and this is interesting, is that not just in Second Life, but in many different now fairly rich psychological studies, we've demonstrated that if you have this ability to create a kind of a something like you but somewhat different, it actually causes generally positive, come and cost me after this, and I'll defend that. It causes generally positive changes backwards to your real person, both psychologically and physically. That is to say, having an avatar that you can customize to a greater degree than we could easily, say, change our own bodies here, generally causes real, notable, and for the most part, positive changes in your own self, which is another way of looking at that. This idea of, what would it be like to have tentacles? The general theory is that it would be good in some way because it would teach you something new, and you'd adapt to it in a positive way.
Okay, all right. I want to get back to the concept of social VR and take it one step further based on something John talked about in our pre-panel telephone call. And please feel free to jump in after I basically pose it. And the question is, all right, you're in a social VR situation talking to other people. In VR generally, you can bring up information on, well, let's say you have a user interface that allows you to bring up information. How do you distinguish private pixels from public pixels? How do you know what only you are seeing versus what everyone else in the room are seeing? Do we need a user interface bill of rights or something? Is that pretty much?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Opinions on that? That gets to the heart of an aspect of user interface design. Are you going to allow for private pixels, or is everything public, or is there a blend?
By private, John, do you mean not visible to my, a house into which only I can go, or a display which only I can see? Do you mean more the latter?
Well, I mean, if we're gonna restrict ourselves to VR, the question actually has to be inverted. What guarantee do I have that you're seeing the same thing that I am?
Yes.
Right? The physical world has this awesome property that if Philip and I are looking in the same direction, I spend zero cognitive overhead wondering whether he's seeing the same thing that I am. I get that for free. It's one of the many wonderful free things we get here in the physical world. And no one has done anything. I mean, there's no UI yet. There are no UI elements that try to recapitulate that in any kind of non-shared pixel world, which is why at Oblong we've started with shared pixels. We put the pixels in the room where they have that same property, right? So, this is all a liability of the way we've been building computers and displays for the last 35 years, which is that they're for one person at a time. If it's on my screen, it somehow belongs to me, and if someone looks over my shoulder, then that's my fault. But other than that, there's no obligation on the part of the UI to try to distinguish between stuff that's meant for me and stuff that's meant for someone who might be nearby. But if we all own the pixel space, how's that designation demonstrated?
It comes up a little bit already in multiplayer video games.
Yeah.
You can have, like on a PC, you might have the different settings, and so you're actually looking at different stuff. You think you're playing in the same space, but it's being rendered completely differently for each of you. That generally doesn't matter very much, except for there are some cases when you can change the gameplay by changing what settings you have, and then it matters a lot.
Yeah.
So there was a game called America's Army, which was for the U.S. military, where it was a 16-player game. 8 players played U.S. Army and 8 players played terrorists. Everyone always played the U.S. Army from their POV.
Yeah.
And so it just was a graphics mapping of skinning. And that might be it.
That's fascinating.
Yep.
Cool. I'm going to go to questions. Actually, are there questions in the audience? I see one back there. Sure.
Hey, Phil.
Oh, Jim.
This is good to see you.
Hey.
This has been a fascinating panel. But what I'm missing here, there was a little bit of touching on it, but I'd like to hear more, is shared experience. I mean, I put on the Oculus Rift, and all of a sudden I'm by myself. Most of entertainment is a shared experience in the theater, even at home with your significant other. This seems very isolated, although there's a little bit of time. How is this going to be a shared experience? Yeah, I get the game, but I'm talking about entertainment, or is this just going to be a games phenomenon and that's it?
Before Philip runs with that, John, do you want to say anything about your system as a shared experience?
Yeah, well, my system works in the real world, so we get that for free, right? You're still sitting there looking with other human beings who have physical bodies and so forth, so
Perfect. Philip?
thank you.
Oh, well, yeah, obviously, I mean, my work is profoundly to enable the shared experience, but as you say, it is the experience where you and I are avatars. We are in the space and able to communicate with each other perfectly. I think as we get closer and closer to that, the lines will be blurred, but yes, I see what you mean. The Oculus Rift head-mounted display obscures your view of your friend sitting next to you on the couch, which is, I think, what you're getting at. So you're sort of having at least a mediated. You're not having a real sort of normal one-on-one experience with somebody. You're minimally seeing them as the avatar next to you.
Okay. I actually want to ask a follow-up question to Jim's. Jim is from Washington. He's a policy guy. So I want to ask a policy question to you guys. Sorry. All right. But here's a question, and I'll see if any of you have even thought about this. So VR allows for very powerful sense of presence and empathy. How do you protect children from zombies, from being either traumatized by being attacked or desensitized to grown-ups coming close to them? Have you thought about the social aspects of controlling your sense of presence within the environment? Okay.
That supposes that the experience of seeing zombies inside VR is somehow more terrifying or more real than seeing them on a TV, right?
Well, more than in real life, because on TV you're distanced by the rectangle.
I would contest that. I'm not sure about that at all.
Really?
Yeah, is it scarier
Okay.
than being told a story when you're 3 years old? Are you sure? I don't
Okay.
think so.
The audience wins.
Well, I saw an interview with one of the people making a VR horror experience, and he was concerned they might have gone too far already. They're like, that, it could be so scary that it was, unhealthy. Actually, he was worried about that, and he was making the experience.
Why do we view ourselves as so frail and fragile? It's ridiculous. Remember when the car was first invented, people thought your chest would collapse if the car went more than 25 miles an hour?
All right.
Right? We exist in zero, we exist in harsh vacuum, we can exist underwater. Why do we think that our psyches will collapse?
All right. I would personally like the ability to have a dial to control my personal space, and you cannot come closer. All right, go ahead.
Frail and fragile is for the kids. That is his point. You said at children. It was his point.
Children are the most resilient life forms out there.
Not when they're being attacked by adults.
Sorry, not when they're...
Not when they're being attacked by adults. It's a very scary experience.
If they're being attacked by real adults, that's
The point
true.
is, children have an issue. They're not the same as what we are at the age of 24 and above and beyond. Okay? You know, think about it.
Yeah, that's the point.
Kids are not adults.
Right, I just wanted to raise the
They're
issue.
prepared to handle with the intellectual stimulation of an area. So your point is, I understand from an adult standpoint, but not from a child standpoint. Let's not forget about kids compared to adults.
Right, we'll buy it.
Ever read Grimm's fairy tales?
Cinderella.
Kids have better on-off switches than we do.
That's because they're traumatized and they're trying to forget about it.
All right, let me move on. A question over here.
So, Phil, whatever happened to
Well,
micro-retinal scanners? Whatever happened? I mean, McLuhan said, we use our knowledge like a flashlight and shine into our own eyes. So where we are, all of us kind of frozen in the trauma of Oculus's success. A scuba mask.
Right.
Or slide a crappy low-resolution cell phone into or there. No, that's not true, right? So maybe the screen, since we're talking AI, is the thing that's holding us back. So remember, University of Washington, microretinal scanners, the notion was, the point is, paint the fovea, paint the back of the eye.
well, that's where we think Magic Leap is going.
That's
Well,
right.
we-
Back to your scuba mask.
But-
Is there another way?
Well, we could all, I bet we could,
What
They
it-
get rid of the screen altogether
Well-
and have it, they put the line touch and go to the world.
No, that's not true.
Aspect to talk about, maybe not, because then it could be subjective as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got another thing we didn't touch on at all is collaboration and building together like the Japanese hologram.
Oh, I actually had that on my list. We just, anyway. Yes.
On your list, I'm sorry.
No.
Well, just one orienting statement I'd make that I think is interesting is we are about, so we know that technology, as you know, everything kind of doubles in resolution about every 2 years. Let's just conservatively say that. Right now, the Oculus Rift is, I'm just going to use very round numbers, it's showing us about 2,000 pixels across a distance of about a 100-degree field of view. The sensitivity of our eye to information, when Apple came out with the Retina display, that was defensibly the point at which, for a normal adult at a comfortable viewing distance, you could no longer see the pixels. And therefore, and this is a problem for the display industry right now, it didn't matter if we sold you any more of them because you couldn't see them. They just blurred together in your vision. It is interesting to note that for the head-mounted display or the retinal scanning or the Magic Leap, leaky waveguide or whatever they're doing, doesn't matter. All of this comes from a computer projection of a bunch of data. We are actually going to reach Retina for these head-mounted displays in about 2 more Moore's intervals. So we're going to go to the 4K display and the 8K display, and I'll leave the math to you, but the 8K display is the point at which we basically can't see the pixels anymore. So what that means, and this is fascinating, is that while these head-mounted displays may be big and look kind of crappy today, we are literally, say 6 years away from having the display present this amount of information to you right now. And that's pretty sobering. And I would say that it doesn't, yes, maybe the planar displays with lenses in front of them isn't the right way, but it doesn't matter. We'll figure that out. The bigger problem is lots of little pixels. And when we get to 8K displays, it's game over in terms of this room looking like this room.
So let me ask the other point she brought up, which is the whole idea of collaboration. We're getting to, we've been talking about being able to use your hand, being able to use your head, your eyes, et cetera. For all 4 of you, are there barriers to global collaboration? Are there latency issues over long distances, or can we pretty much, are we heading so that fairly soon we will have the technology to allow for collaboration? Then it's just the question of motivating people to work with you. Or are there barriers to collaboration?
Well, I don't know how many Skype users there are out there, but I think Skype works reasonably well. And when I started out using it in early 2000, there was a lot of bandwidth issues and latency issues. And one of the guys I used to work with at Oculus, who's a famous guy, Carmack, says, why does it take 12 milliseconds to get a electron from New York back to me, and it takes 17 milliseconds on my PC to go from a keystroke to showing up on the screen? And that's because the world wants high bandwidth internet, and everyone worked on that problem and determined that the PC bandwidth at 18 milliseconds was fine. Well, for VR, it's not. It may be outside the realm of. So, I think that there's enough bandwidth right now to do social interaction. It's an awful lot of data from a stereo camera to transmit. And so maybe you can't do that at 4K or 8K, or maybe it's highly compressed. But there's enough right now to do it.
What about computational power? Because you're talking about rendering a changing world as well as the transmission.
For social interaction, it's just coming off of a camera. There's no rendering to be done. So there's plenty of bandwidth to do that now. I haven't heard of anybody working on that particular thing, but maybe there are out there somewhere in the world. But
okay. John, is your system any different, or would the answer be the same?
Well, forget my system. I mean, I think we're sort of stuck talking about technologically mediated solutions, and I don't think that any of the stuff that we're actually interested in is going to be automatically solved when we get to 4K or 8K or 3 milliseconds or 17 milliseconds. That's not the point. It's all solvable, past some minimal threshold by design, by UI design. And that's the thing that no one's really talking much about yet or doing much about. So if we had the will to build collaborative systems, we could start to do it. But there's not much work on that yet, right? None of the computers that we build today is about collaboration. They're about one person at a time. We've got cues and clues here in the real world. where we actually work with each other sometimes, where we're not beating each other up or firing bullets at each other. So we can start there.
Yeah, but there is a magical thing, in my opinion, though, that being true as well, there is a magic thing, though, that's happened in the last few years, and Jack was speaking to it. It's the time that it takes a packet to go halfway around the world, which is as long as anything can take because you can send it the other way if it's a shorter distance. The speed of light limits that to about 70 milliseconds, a little bit less than a tenth of a second. That's the speed of light in a glass fiber. As you were saying, the demand for more and more bandwidth on the internet, for more and more Netflix or whatever, has basically driven us to build routers which now pass the data from one point to another at pretty much that speed, pretty close to it. The ping time right now, one-way ping over the internet to Singapore, which is halfway around, is about 100 milliseconds. Now, 100 milliseconds is an interesting number because when you talk on your cell phone to somebody and you feel like you're stepping on each other, that's because the delay is about 400 milliseconds. That's about how slow our cell phones are today. It's a terrible experience. It's why we try not to use them anymore. The delay, as you can imagine, yeah, like how many people actively or aggressively using your phones, right? As opposed to text messaging. The delay at which you stop noticing that and we're having a normal conversation for speaking is about 100 milliseconds or a tenth of a second. And guess what? To Philip's question, that is the magic point. So we are at a point where for speaking, now, Richard, throwing a ball back and forth, what would you say? The way we were just talking about it at dinner.
Yeah, and
it's like somewhere
throwing
around
is
there.
even easier than actually
Catch.
when you hold something and both have it in one hand and try to do this. Like
Yeah.
doing this is really, really hard.
Shaking
with
hands.
two people in VR or something. Yeah.
So it may be a little bit less. It might be more like 50 milliseconds. But the point here is, if you do the programming right, actually, we can put all of ourselves in intimate collaborative contact with each other from anywhere to anywhere pretty much right now, if we write the software to do that. But it's a really good point, because 10 years ago, this was absolutely not true. When I started Second Life, the delays were much higher than that, and they're very objectionable, as you know from using your cell phones. By the way, as a final point, playing music together as two live musicians, which no doubt somebody in here has thought of. Yes, we've tested that, as have others as well, and unfortunately the answer there is brutal. When live musicians are essentially speaking to each other when they're standing next to each other, the maximum tolerable latency is only about 15 milliseconds, meaning that the internet can't do it yet. So the short answer is to play live music together. You're always going to have to co-locate the musicians in the same room, but pretty much everything else we're going to do, like business and trust and everything else, we're going to be able to do online.
Cool.
So-
Back here.
I think we all agree that Yoda was better as a puppet. And that's because we could perceive the gravity of when we were watching it versus the CGI. And you just said about throwing a ball back and forth. I know you can create the UI that shows me the difference between throwing a tennis ball and throwing a shot put because of how far it goes based on the force. But how are you at all working on communicating that to me in terms of what I feel when I'm doing it? Because I have a very different feeling between throwing a ping pong ball or a shot put. Is there any way, either in the mental perception of that or in the way it feels with my hand?
There's a lot of problems about feedback and haptics and doing that in VR. It's very hard to achieve any of those feelings because you have so many sensors all over your body that you would have to stimulate somehow. The eyes are very localized, so that's our best place to get information in, and it's one of the most important. But audio is a pretty good substitute for haptics when you can get away with it. So feeling like you hear something and its magnitude is a good thing. It's not a replacement for haptics, but I mean, it's not a perfect replacement, but it's useful. That's one of the things that we use a lot is audio. But actually interacting with anything in VR, your hands pass right through things in VR. And what do you do with that? All those interface questions are pretty interesting. It's hard to solve in a universal way, I guess. Right?
So in the future, you could have a robotic exoskeleton that gave you feedback. But it's not going to be practical in the near term.
Yeah, but there's different people working on that problem. So the virtual hand maybe stops, but a ghost hand continues on and it penetrates into the structures and things. But I didn't feel it. Maybe you can make a slight rumble feeling, and that's pretty powerful when it clicks right at the right time spatially. That's pretty good. A little bit of haptics goes a long ways actually in VR, so that's our answer right now.
Cool.
Or even sort of a deliberate synesthetic sidestep of the haptics thing, like a flash can be just as effective, right?
Do you really want a 20-pound shot put ball in VR though? you want a half-pound ball that feels like, oh yeah.
No, it'll be like an Acme shot put.
There's a company called Tactical Haptics that has this controller that pulls on your skin in a slight way, and it simulates the weight of something just by pulling more on your skin. Obviously, it doesn't actually have weight, but because it pulls on your skin more, you think it must be heavier. That's kind of a trick.
Sure, over here.
iOS has the human interface guidelines, Android has the Android design guidelines. When will we ever see some kind of human interface guidelines for VR?
When somebody starts working on it, maybe? Or what?
If someone has a problem.
Well, there
When
is.
someone needs to work on it?
I'm not working with them, but there's the OSVR, the open source VR standards organization, with a number of Silicon Valley players that are members of it, and they're talking about it. Go to their website, OSVR, and see what they're working on. Are they? I should actually go outside sometime. Okay. He says they're in the hallway. More
But that's a
questions?
great question. That really is the question, right? Like, who's going to start to put together just a little bit of vocabulary, just a little bit of syntax, just some grammar? We don't even need that much to get started. We need a little something. And just like iOS didn't give you everything right away, you couldn't even copy and paste with version 1. You know, you sort of do all the stuff that you can figure out, let people catch up, then you teach them the next thing and the next thing. So I think we could start simply.
Well, there already is something like that for video games. I mean, it's the regular 2D screens have, the controllers are very similar now, and they all map to similar behavior. So we have something like a language.
De facto.
And actually for VR, a lot of the systems are converging on an intermediate solution, which they all look very similar to spatial controllers with triggers and.
Yeah. Yeah, the hardware is still pretty different, so we're kind of early, but that is a key point. I mean, that's when a lot of stuff evolutionarily in this space will start happening, and it's true. Right now, we're all just trying to prototype different pieces of hardware and see what kind of shakes out. It's going to take another couple of years for that to, optimistically, for that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll have to get into consumers' hands before you know what you want to standardize. Excuse me, it's an emerging technology. One last question? Sure.
It's not a question, it's a form of response.
Okay.
Both Oculus and Leap Motion have best practices guides, and they're really, they're like 40-page documents that talk about most of the things you think about in the first year of VR development. So it's a good starting point.
Right, and they're best practices for technology and health, but not necessarily for art. And when you start thinking of art, those might change. So let me ask the panel one last question. It's 2015, last time I checked. 2020 is only 5 years away. What do you think this space is going to look like? What do you expect to see in VR, and what do you expect to see in AR 5 years from now? Oh,
Well-
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So VR developed out of mobile phones. That's where it came from. I mean, it's been around for 30 years or 50 years or whatever it is. But it really did not happen until mobile phones came along with high-res displays and a sensor inside there that would give you rotation and gravity. That's what sort of launched it again. When those became reasonably priced, it became feasible to build something that people could buy. Before that, they were $20,000 and totally out of the realm of what people could do. So I talk about displays, and you brought this issue up. There is a limit at what, the granularity of the display or the screen door effects starts to bother you. And there's 720p, which was Developer Kit 1, that bothered me. DK2, I could still see the screen door effect. Vive, I don't see it. And so that may be the limit. And also the screens might be specific to VR. There might be a technology for screens that's not a mobile phone technology. There's just not the demand in the market for it to build a glass line to make displays is very, very expensive. It's $100 million, and there just isn't the demand in the market to build a specialized custom display. It looks like they're going towards OLED, which is basically an LED, tiny little LEDs sprinkled all over the place. The LCD stuff is too slow, perceived to be too slow. It's going to head in that direction. Magic Leap, I don't know if that's what it'll be. That's probably a very expensive proposition. And if you want to get it in everyone's hands, to have everyone to have it, and then you'll have content, it's probably going to be something like what it is now, I think. And it's unfortunate that it has to sit on your face. I find that it's very uncomfortable. It presses on my sinuses and I perspire. Maybe
tell
those
us
problems.
about it.
What's that? Maybe those problems can be fixed. And you know, you brought up Moore's law. There's the possibility that these mobile processors and mobile GPUs will shrink down to the point where we can put the entire platform in the head and be untethered. And maybe connected with LTE where you can download content, or Wi-Fi, or whatever it is. But again, you know, we're sort of hinged to the mobile world, the low power processors and low power devices, and so that may be where it is. I'd like to get rid of the cord. It's really annoying, especially if you want to walk around.
Well, you have 5 years to do it.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah. Philip, what do you want to say?
Well, I'd say in 5 years, AR still won't be materially successful. I think it's too hard. We got a registration problem and a position sensing problems there that are pretty serious, and we don't have anything on the horizon to fix them. I think that VR will likely be obviously a prevalent phenomena. That's certainly what I'm working on. I think that, like the internet, in comparison to, say, CD-ROMs, we don't understand right now what it's going to look like. I think VR is probably like the internet. I think it's likely to be profoundly disruptive because of its ability to connect people, not because of its ability to depict scenes. And I think that that means that, like the internet, you guys all remember what the internet felt like to you in '95. Even if you were really into it like I was, you didn't get it. You didn't get it. You thought it was a bibliographic tool. You didn't understand what it was. I didn't understand what it was, and I was totally down with it. I was, you know, building my whole career on it. So I think VR will be the same thing. I think when we talk about like making movies and watching them on HMDs, we're going to look back on that like we look back on CD-ROMs. We forgot about them. They were swamped by greater, more bizarre changes in our behavior that were driven by the very basic fabric of the internet. And I think that we'll only get to that, and I think we can in 5 years if we have these hand controllers like we've talked about. You actually do have to have a completely functional replacement for the computer, so to speak. And I think we can get to that. So I think it's going to be fascinating to look back and see what things look like.
Great, thank you. Richard.
Yeah, I think there's some things engineering-wise we can see the trajectory very clearly. Resolution and putting photons in your eyes will just get better. But that won't fundamentally change. That'll just change the kind of quality, or kind of a quantitative change. And what we do with VR, I don't think has been defined yet, and why we care about it so much isn't known yet. And that's hard to predict because we don't have enough, you know, data for that. But I think the interaction side of VR is where it's going to get its strength, and that's the part we don't have very strong consistency on. So it's one that it's hard to predict, and it's what I work on. So I have good job security for the next 5 years, which is great. So, but I think that's the hardest part of VR right now is the interaction.
Great, thank you. And John, you get the last word.
Yeah, well, supposing that we do make a little bit of progress on that interaction stuff, which I think is totally feasible, the most exciting thing for me is to think that by 5 years from now, we could have enabled a kind of continuity along the spectrum that goes from VR through to AR to RR, real reality with pixels on the wall that everyone can see, that kind of thing. So, I don't know, something, you're an urban planner, you get an alert on your little smartphone, the Pope or a Pope has come to your city, traffic is being violently disrupted, you start working on the problem here, you walk into a room, there's no reason today, computation ends at the physical boundary of your device, which is just Looney Tunes, right? But that's how we built machines. But 5 years from now, with appropriate operating systems or operating system overlays, there's no reason you couldn't walk into this room and make those pixels on that projected surface part of your workspace, and then bring other people in so you're collaborating, and then you need to see what the city's disrupted traffic pattern looks like, and a couple of you strap on the AR, right, and start walking around the extension of that experience into a consensual 3D space. I think that kind of experience where it's a continuity of world versus a kind of binary, now I'm not in it, now I'm in it, is going to make all the difference. And that's the kind of thing I can easily see spending the next 5 years working on, ideally with all of you and all of you.
Fantastic. Well, we have 4 amazing people up here. Please. Thank you.